tiny virus that the World Health Organization insists that we call SARS-CoV-2 actually should be called the China virus because, as President Trump once famously said, it came from China. In fact, every little viral packet, too small really to be seen by the naked eye, should have etched on it, "Made in China," because that was the country of origin of the coronavirus in more ways than one. I had reached that conclusion by the end of January 2020, because to me, all roads led to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I wasn't quite sure how much the virus had been engineered at that point, but I was certain that it came from the lab. And I wrote about that in the pages of the New York Post about a week later, in an article that was quickly censored on social media. Censored, we now know, by the efforts of Dr. Anthony Fauci to hide the laboratory origins of the virus, and instead cooperate with the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda apparatus in trying to convince us that the virus had actually come from a wet market and that it was a result of someone eating a bat, an innocent zoonosis, a virus from the vat passing over to a human being. It wasn't that at all. It was clear to me at the outset that it came from the lab. The reason was that the first cases of people who came down with coronavirus actually were people who lived in and around the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The second clue was that the first response of the Chinese government to the outbreak of the epidemic was not to send down the experts from China's Center for Disease Control at all. It was to send down the head of China's bioweapons program, Major General Chen Wei. And she, by the way, a year later was given the highest award of the People's Republic of China by none other than Supreme Leader Xi Jinping himself for her work on the epidemic. Why would the PLA bioweapons experts immediately show up at the lab? Because, as we now know, the lab was carrying out research in conjunction with the People's Liberation Army bioweapons program to develop new and dangerous coronaviruses. We also learned very early on that the head of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a woman named Dr. Shi Zhengli is her full name, Dr. Shi had studied in the United States and learned genetic engineering at the lab run by Dr. Ralph Barrick of the University of North Carolina, and then had furthered her research and her studies at the University of Texas labs, the Galveston labs of the University of Texas. So she was trained in the United States in gain-of-function research, gain-of-function being efforts to make existing viruses both more deadly and more infectious. Those were the functions that the viruses were to gain. They were to become more infectious and more lethal. Gain-of-function research, of course, we'll talk about that in a later segment, but it's highly, highly dangerous research. But the point I want to make here is that Dr. Shi had both the motive, because she was being urged by the PLA to do bioweapons research, and the opportunity given by the fact that she was working at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, using techniques that she had learned from the United States to develop a deadly virus, and that in fact is indeed what she did. And then looking back at the history of her publications, some of which were published in conjunction with Dr. Ralph Barrick of the University of North Carolina and other people in the United States with whom she was collaborating, there's a long paper trail here of showing step by step how over the years, beginning about 10 years ago, she was gradually moving towards the creation of more and deadly and infectious viruses, that she was deliberately making insertions into existing coronavirus backbones, new insertions that made those viruses more infectious and more lethal. So the published work of Dr. Sher shows the direction that she's going. The PLA bioweapons program was a part of the lab in Wuhan, and the epicenter of the epidemic was in Wuhan. And who was brought in to deal with the consequences of the virus coming out of the lab? None other than the person in charge of the PLA bioweapons program. So that, to me, as I said on Tucker Carlson's show in February of 2020, that to me was proof positive that I was absolutely certain that the virus had come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The only question in my mind at that time was, had it accidentally leaked out of the lab, or had it been deliberately spread around the world? There was other evidence that came out later of its artificial origins. If you look at a virus and you look at how it mutates over time, those mutations are random. Some of those mutations cause actual changes in the amino acids that make up a protein, and some of them don't. In the case of the coronavirus, there were clear segments of the backbone of the coronavirus that remained intact, unmutated from its original backbone. Clearly, this hadn't been the product of any sort of natural evolution. And we found out that it was almost perfectly adapted from the get-go to infect human beings. And you look back at Dr. Sher's publication record and you see that she was using in the lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, she was using humanized mice. That is, mice whose cells reacted in the same way that human cells would to exposure to a virus. So by serial passage through humanized mice, she was able to create a coronavirus that from the get-go, from its very release, was highly infectious and somewhat deadly to human beings. Again, more proof that the virus had originated in the lab itself. And then finally, of course, we have Chinese whistleblowers who've come forward. The most famous of those whistleblowers, and a personal hero of mine, is Dr. Yen Li-Meng. Dr. Yen worked not at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but at the Level 3 lab in Hong Kong, which is the World Health Organization's primary lab for doing research on coronaviruses. So she's intimately familiar with coronaviruses and with gain-of-function research, and because she was originally from China, she was familiar with the kind of research that was being done there, at least the open research, not the research that was being done in secret by the PLA. And as soon as she began to hear word of a dangerous virus on the loose in China in December of 2019, she began to inquire among her Chinese colleagues on the mainland what was going on. And she quickly concluded that this was a product of the lab. And she was told by her lab director in Hong Kong that she should not breathe a word about her findings, otherwise both he and she would be, quote unquote, disappeared. Well, what does it mean to be disappeared? It means to be abducted by agents of the Chinese Communist Party and taken somewhere and either put in jail for life or executed. So she decided, in order to get the truth out, that she had no choice but to board a flight to the United States and come and tell our government exactly what her findings were. And that's exactly what she did. She left her job, she left her homeland, and she left her husband, who was opposed to her going public with this information, and came over to tell the truth, confirming everything that I had suspected about the origins of the virus and what was going on in the PLA bioweapons program. So the bottom line is there's no doubt that this was a genetically engineered product of the Wuhan Institute of Virology and other labs in China working in concert with the PLA bioweapons program. And I'm afraid it will not be the last bioweapon that we're faced with in our lifetimes.